first began to research the history of the collieries around Brampton, Lord Carlisle's coalfield, in 1991, when I moved to the area from East Lancashire to work in the pits of Alston Moor. After an appeal for information, I was contacted by Michael Tickner, who then lived in France, and he sent me a series of recordings that he'd done in the 1970s. These were an oral history he carried out with men who used to work in the local pits. Andrew Ruddick had been born in 1885 and started to work at Roachburn Colliery in 1899. Andrew later became the trade union leader for the area. He was also the driving force behind starting the venture drift. He had a very close working relationship with Charlie Roberts also, and in this particular recording we get Andrew's eyewitness account of the day of the Roachburn disaster, where he had been working on the fore shift and went back on the rescue operations. Roachburn itself had always been a difficult colliery to work. It had first been started in 1860 in conjunction with the Byron on the Haltwhistle side of the hill, but the pit itself had finished in 1875 when it hit the Wind Dyke. By the time the 1890s arrived, the Thompsons, who had leased the collieries for quite a number of years by then, since the 1830s, were now running out of coal because many of the older collieries, the valuable coals, had been worked out. So Roachburn, the reopening of it, was a last-ditched attempt to salvage the coalfield. The geology of the area was difficult also because the seams rose at an angle of 1:1 to the surface, and that is what caused the disaster, as the seam rose under a couple of ponds or tarns way up on the moors. The disaster was very similar to the Knockshinnagh disaster during the 1950s in Scotland. So we will start with Andrew Ruddick, and then Michael Tickner will give us a short account of the official findings from the official reports, and then we'll go back to Andrew Ruddick and his account of that terrible day.
You see, the Thompsons engaged practically 95% of the population that lived between, I would say, Brampton Junction and Lamley. But I would think anywhere between off and on up to 300 men, lads. Well, you see, that was the only pit up to the disaster in 1908. Men and boys, it was boys of my generation, that's the only pit we knew. You couldn't compare it with any other, but you got many a coursing, I'll give you that. She got many a coursing. It was a bad job for the district when the Backstarn went in January the 28th, 1908. We didn't think so at the time, but it was a bad job for this locality.
The Roachburn disaster left a permanent scar on the inhabitants of Hallbank Gate. Both the miners and the coal owners suffered. A Home Office inquiry was held, and in 1908 a report was presented to both Houses of Parliament. I quote from the Home Office report on the causes of and circumstances attending the accident which occurred at Roachburn Colliery, Cumberland, on the 28th of January 1908, from an inflow of clay, sand, moss and water. The inquiry was held at the village hall, Hallbank Gate, near Brampton Junction, on 13th March 1908. The three men who were imprisoned by the inflow and whose bodies have not been recovered were Mathew Hilliard, 53, back Overman, Robert Pattinson, 35, deputy Overman, and James William Warton, 21, a hewer. There were about 120 men in the mine at the time of the inflow, all of whom escaped to the surface without injury by two different routes. 300 persons were employed underground in the various shifts, and the daily output was about 290 tons. The accident was caused by working coal up to the outcrop at a point where the surface deposits were so saturated with water that they gave way and poured into the mine, the quantity being estimated by the manager to be about 90,000 cubic yards, forming a subsidence or cavity on the surface extending over 9 acres and with a depth of 49 feet. Two of the officials of the mine could easily have escaped, but in their devotion to duty and anxiety to secure the escape of all persons under their charge, they lost their lives. The report concludes, apart altogether from the regrettable loss of life, it is certain that had the possibility of the accident been anticipated, no coal would have been worked up to the outcrop under the moss. The result of the accident is the loss of the colliery, a serious pecuniary loss to the owner. Andrew gives us his eyewitness account of the Roachburn disaster.
However, my father and me in Crossmaras, we were woken up in that incline in 1906. So then, in 19 start the river up, put all the Cumbria up, incline, brake wheels and all the rest of it. But they still left the timber in, you see, they didn't draw it out. And they seemingly got an order for the best quality coal, and she was good coal. It was number 9. And they laid her up again in late 1907, and she went away again at the beginning of January 1908. She just went 28 days till she come through, you see. Well, if it had been clean water, we would have pumped her out, you see, but it wasn't. It was just peat moss. It was a great big old peat moss, half the size of practically 10 little town. And that all went in, you see. And there was men walking up there while my brother was putting up there. Next brother to me, he was putting up there at that particular time. And again, if it had been clean water, they would never got the chance, you see, because she would just rushed down and she could have drunk more than it really is back in at the particular time. But as I say, the bodies would all been out, because they were pumped the water out, you see. But it was just slush. Actually, I was in bed. I was on first shift. I was a bed. But where Malice was in, and when Jimmy come home, like, and said what had happened, and I come up to the pit, I went up to the pit head, and the manager come up, and there was a few on his son about me. He said, when we're gone back home, and put my pit clothes on and come back up again. Well, I did. I went away back with 2 or 3 men on, but they didn't turn up. I told me father. And he put his pit clothes on, and we went back up. And we were there from the Tuesday night, midnight, the day it had happened. We were emptying slush on the bank, about eight on us on the shift. 8 hours there and 8 hours off. Up 8 hours on, 8 hours off, back right away till the Friday night, and they gave up hope, you see. There was men inside going forward and pulling this slush into tubes and sending them away at the bank. Well, I don't know whether there was an inspector went down or not. Whether it was stolen or his cell, it seemed. Because there was an uncle of mine, he was a deputy. He was one of the men that was full on this particular shift. And they sometimes got that far in, she rushed past them, you see. And they were frightened that she might come with a big rush and bury them too, so they had to give up hope of getting in there. And it was pitiful watching them home folk. Because Pattinson was the deputy, it was Bardeen, and he had a wife and young family. Matt Hilliard was married, of course, his two daughters and son was grown up like, but they were on the bank all the time. The old woman would hardly ever be a bear, I would say. And Warton, well, he was a single fellow, he was living with his mother and his aunt. But they would have a terrible death, I doubt, if ever they met up. It was bad enough anyway. But Matt Hilliard should have had the VC, really. Because when he went away into Jubilee, this rob bank was coming down as that might be the, you see. And the Jubilee was away in that way, went past her. She was shoving the full tubs there. There were 6 full tubs and 6 empties, the same as there used to be on the chain bank. And she was pushing everything before her then. And there was 2 brothers, colliers, Jim Douglas and Will. When Matt went in, Jim said to him, "There's commissioning suicide, Matt." He said, "I can't help it, Jim. It's my duty." And he was gone in the end. He had an idea of, well, 6 of our own chance on him ever getting back again. He never did. And how they died, or when they died, or whether they met up, or what was the matter with Warton, and anybody know now. Yes, it shortened Mr. Thompson's life. And of course he practically knew every employee of his day were Christian names, you know. And he said to me, he says, "My poor countryside." And I don't know what I can never think I may have seen him anymore. But I know he was just 58 when he died.
It could surely only be a matter of time before a person of Andrew's character would become involved in trades union work. And this occurred during 1914.
My first step